In a quiet suburban neighborhood, letters began to arrive. They were addressed to the police, the newspapers, and sometimes to no one at all. But what they contained was enough to send chills through an entire town. Each letter detailed crimes so shocking and so meticulously planned that investigators were left with more questions than answers. The author of these letters wasn't just a bystander. He was the killer himself. This is the story of the man who called himself BTK, meaning bind, torture, kill. It began with a single envelope, an unmarked, ordinary piece of mail that arrived at the Wichita Eagle in 1974. The paper inside bore no fingerprints, no DNA, no immediate clue to its sender, except for the words written in eerie, detached precision. The author confessed to killing 4 members of the Otero family, describing each chilling detail as though recounting a routine task. The letter wasn't a cry for help or remorse. It was a message, a challenge, and a warning. Wichita, Kansas, had always been a quiet city, a place where families felt safe, where doors were often left unlocked, and neighbors trusted one another. But everything changed with that letter. It wasn't just a confession. It was a taunt. The writer, who signed off as BTK, short for bind, torture, kill, wasn't content with simply taking lives. He needed the world to know what he had done. He craved the attention, the fear, the control. The letter described how the killer stalked the Otero family, learning their habits and routines. He recounted the way he entered their home, bound them, and ended their lives with chilling efficiency. Details only the murderer could know were laid bare on the page, as if to say, "I'm smarter than you. You'll never catch me." The newsroom was paralyzed. The police were horrified. A murderer was out there, walking among them, sending letters as if this were a game, and he had just made his opening move. Months passed without another killing, and people began to hope that the nightmare was over. But hope was short-lived. Another letter arrived, and another life was taken. Each time, the killer's words grew more taunting, more confident. He wasn't just committing crimes. He was orchestrating fear, controlling the narrative, and watching as an entire community unraveled. Wichita was no longer the safe, quiet city it had once been. The streets emptied earlier. People installed locks on their doors. Children were no longer allowed to play outside after dark. The BTK Killer had turned their lives into a constant state of anxiety, and the police had little to offer in terms of reassurance. Behind the scenes, detectives were scrambling. They analyzed every word of the letters, searching for clues. They compared handwriting, examined language patterns, and tried to piece together a profile of the man behind the typewriter. But for every clue, there was a dead end. And with each passing day, the fear grew. This man might never be caught. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the letters stopped. The killing stopped. Months turned into years. For a moment, Wichita began to exhale. But the scars remained, and the question lingered. Was he still out there, watching, waiting for the right time to strike again? Little did they know, the BTK Killer wasn't gone. He was living among them. He attended church services, volunteered with the Boy Scouts, and raised a family. He was their neighbor, their colleague, their friend. This is the story of Dennis Rader, the man who called himself BTK. A man who meticulously planned his crimes, taunted law enforcement, and evaded capture for over 30 years. A man who blended into the fabric of a community while holding it in a grip of terror. Wichita, Kansas, a city known for its aviation industry and small-town charm, where life moved at a predictable, comfortable pace. Neighbors exchanged warm greetings, children roamed the streets freely, and doors were rarely locked. For decades, this Midwestern city had prided itself on its safety, a place where community ties were strong and trust was the foundation of daily life. But in January 1974, that trust was shattered, and the sense of security that defined Wichita was replaced by fear. The Otero family was an emblem of the American dream. Joseph Otero, a proud veteran of the U.S. Air Force, had settled in Wisconsin with his wife, Julie, and their 5 children. After years of serving his country, Joseph had secured a stable job in the aviation industry, providing a comfortable life for his family. Julie, a devoted wife and mother, managed their household with care and love, ensuring that her children, Charlie, Danny, Carmen, Josephine, and Joseph Jr., had everything they needed. Their home was modest, but full of life, a place of laughter, warmth, and family dinners. 11-year-old Josephine was a bright, cheerful girl with a love for school and friends, while 9-year-old Joseph Jr. was an energetic boy who adored spending time with his siblings. For the Oteros, life in Wichita was everything they had hoped for. But on the morning of January 15, 1974, the Otero household went eerily quiet. By the afternoon, that silence would become a haunting void. The Otero family was murdered in their own home. Joseph, Julie, Josephine, and Joseph Jr. were bound and killed in what police described as a meticulously planned attack. The crime scene was horrifying, evidence of control and premeditation at every turn. The victims had been tied up with precision, their lives taken in a sequence that left investigators both stunned and confused. When Carmen, one of the older Otero children, arrived home from school that afternoon, she was greeted by a scene no child should ever witness. Inside the house, she found her parents and younger siblings lifeless. The horrifying discovery sent shockwaves through the family and the entire community. For investigators, the crime was baffling. Nothing seemed to have been stolen. There was no sign of forced entry. The precision of the killings suggested a methodical mind, someone who had taken time to plan every detail. The question loomed large. Who would commit such an act and why? Wichita's residents were paralyzed with fear. This was not a city accustomed to random acts of violence, much less a crime of this magnitude. Parents began locking their doors, something they hadn't done in years. Children were no longer allowed to play outside unsupervised. Neighbors looked at one another with suspicion, wondering if the killer was among them. Then, months later, a letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle's newsroom. The writer claimed responsibility for the Otero murders. The letter was cold, methodical, and taunting. It detailed aspects of the crime that only the killer could know, leaving no doubt about its authenticity. At the bottom of the page, the writer signed off with 3 chilling initials, BTK. Wichita, once a symbol of Midwestern tranquility, had become a city haunted by an unknown predator. The Otero murders were only the beginning. The BTK Killer wasn't just taking lives. He was orchestrating a campaign of fear, and he was just getting started. It started with a single envelope, a seemingly ordinary piece of mail delivered to the Wichita Eagle newsroom on a cool Tuesday morning in October 1974. Inside was a letter that would change everything, a confession so chilling, so precise. It left no doubt that the writer was the killer of 4 members of the Otero family. He signed the letter simply as BTK, a moniker that would haunt Wichita for decades to come. The letter was meticulously written, describing every detail of the Otero murders. The knots he tied, the sequence of his attacks, even the emotions he claimed to feel as he took their lives. Everything was laid out in haunting clarity. The writer taunted law enforcement, mocking their inability to catch him and demanding recognition. He wanted to be known, not as a faceless criminal, but as a name etched into the darkest pages of history. His message ended with a chilling question. How many do I have to kill before I get my name in the paper or some national attention? The Otero murders were unlike anything Wichita had experienced. Joseph and Julie Otero, along with their children Joseph Jr. and Josephine, were found bound and lifeless in their own home. Investigators described a level of control and planning that left them baffled. The killer had taken his time, ensuring that each step was executed perfectly. The details of the murders were gruesome. Joseph, the father, was suffocated with a plastic bag. Julie, the mother, was strangled with a cord. Josephine, just 11 years old, was hung in the basement. Each family member had been bound in a way that immobilized them completely. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of forced entry, and no apparent motive. The community was paralyzed with fear. Wichita had always been a place where people felt safe, where neighbors looked out for one another, and where crime was rare. The Otero murders shattered that illusion. Parents began locking their doors for the first time. Children were no longer allowed to play outside unsupervised. Everyone wondered the same thing. Who could have done this? And would they strike again? Then came another murder. Catherine Bright was a 21-year-old woman with her whole life ahead of her. On April 4th, 1974, she was attacked in her own home. Like the Oteros, she was bound and killed. But this time, there was a witness, her brother Kevin. He had been stabbed but managed to escape, barely clinging to life. Kevin later described the attacker as a man with dark hair and glasses, but the description wasn't enough to lead to an arrest. Shortly after Catherine's murder, another letter arrived. The killer described how he had stalked Catherine for weeks, learning her routine and planning the attack. The letter detailed how he had almost abandoned the plan when her brothers showed up unexpectedly. The BTK Killer's letters continued. Each one was more taunting than the last, filled with chilling details that hadn't been released to the public. He described his victims as projects, revealing how he stalked them, fantasized about their deaths, and planned every step of his attacks. In one particularly disturbing letter he wrote, "When this monster enters my brain, I will never know. But it is here to stay. How does one cure himself? I can't stop it. It drives me to kill." For investigators, the letters were both a blessing and a curse. They provided valuable insight into the killer's mind, but also highlighted his ability to outsmart them. The police were under immense pressure to solve the case, but BTK's lack of physical evidence left them with little to work with. Over the years, BTK's pattern became clearer. He would stalk his victims for weeks, sometimes months, before striking. He chose his targets carefully, usually women who lived alone or families who seemed vulnerable. He thrived on the planning, the control, and the aftermath. But BTK wasn't just killing. He was manipulating an entire community. Through his letters, he forced Wichita to live in fear, always wondering when and where he would strike next. The murders had left a community shattered, but the letters left investigators baffled. Wichita's law enforcement was now faced with a predator who didn't just kill. He communicated, taunted, and dared them to stop him. The question wasn't just who BTK was, but how someone so brazen could continue to elude capture. The Otero murders had marked the beginning of a chilling pattern, but the arrival of the first letter months later shifted the investigation entirely. The letter was both a taunt and a confession, meticulously describing the crime with details that only the killer could know. The writer, who signed the letter BTK, outlined the sequence of events, from stalking the family to binding, torturing, and killing them. The Wichita Eagle staff handed the letter over to the police, and the investigation entered a new phase. Forensic experts examined the handwriting and language patterns. Linguists noted that BTK's language was structured and methodical, his tone detached, and his vocabulary sophisticated. Psychologists profiled him as a highly intelligent individual with an overwhelming need for control and recognition. The letter ended with a chilling challenge. How many do I have to kill before I get my name in the paper or some national attention? It was clear that BTK was not only a killer, but also someone who craved notoriety and thrived on psychological dominance. The police formed a dedicated task force to track the killer, but progress was painfully slow. The crime scenes offered little in the way of physical evidence. No fingerprints, no DNA, no clear points of entry or exit. The knots used to bind the victims were consistent and intricate, hinting at someone with knowledge of restraint techniques, possibly military or scouting experience. BTK's letters, while horrifying, provided some of the only leads. Forensic handwriting experts compared the samples to thousands of records, but no match was found. Linguistic analysis suggested that BTK was well-educated and likely employed in a job requiring meticulous attention to detail. Kevin Bright, the lone survivor of BTK's second attack in 1974, offered a critical description: a white man with glasses, dark hair, and a calm demeanor. Kevin recounted how BTK had bound him and his sister, Catherine Bright, and then shot him, leaving him for dead. Catherine didn't survive. Despite Kevin's description, BTK vanished after each crime, leaving no tangible evidence behind. The task force considered multiple theories. Was he a local man with an ordinary job? Someone who knew the victims personally? Or a transient who slipped in and out of town undetected? Every avenue led to dead ends. The Otero and Bright cases were seemingly unconnected, and the lack of physical evidence compounded the frustration. Yet, the letters continued, serving as both clues and psychological torment. In 1978, BTK sent a new letter to KTV, claiming responsibility for more murders. He included specific details that hadn't been released to the public, cementing his authenticity. The police and public were gripped by fear. His arrogance was palpable in every word as he taunted investigators and mocked their efforts. The code words for me will be: bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK. You see, he added again. The letter contained a list of potential projects, as BTK called his victims, hinting that he was actively planning his next attack. It was a clear warning, but it left investigators no closer to identifying him. By the 1980s, advances in forensic analysis offered new hope. Investigators re-examined the letters, analyzing everything from the type of paper used to the postmarks on the envelopes. Handwriting experts noted consistencies in the penmanship, and linguists identified unique phrases that might point to a specific region or background. But the killer remained elusive. He stopped killing, or so it seemed. The letters ceased, and the trail went cold. Some believed BTK had been arrested for an unrelated crime. Others speculated he had died or moved away. Then, in 2004, after more than a decade of silence, BTK resurfaced. A new letter arrived, this time accompanied by a floppy disk. The disk contained instructions, and while BTK believed it was untraceable, investigators discovered otherwise. Metadata embedded in the disk led them to Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita. The church's records pointed to Dennis Rader, a trusted member of the community, who worked as a compliance officer and served as the church council president. Rader's arrest was swift and shocking. The man who had terrorized Wichita for decades turned out to be someone they all knew: a husband, father, church leader, and Boy Scout volunteer. But his outward appearance hid the truth. He was BTK, the man who had eluded capture for more than 30 years. After decades of fear and unanswered questions, a single mistake would bring the BTK killer to justice. For over 30 years, he had taunted law enforcement, mocked the media, and terrified an entire community. But in 2005, the man who called himself BTK finally revealed his true identity. The turning point came in 2004 when Dennis Rader, after years of silence, sent a floppy disk to the Wichita Eagle. Confident in his ability to outsmart investigators, Rader believed the disk was untraceable. But forensic experts quickly identified metadata embedded in the file, leading them to Christ Lutheran Church. Church records pointed directly to Dennis Rader, a 59-year-old compliance officer, husband, father, and respected community member. Investigators were stunned. How could the man who had been living among them, leading Boy Scout meetings, attending church services, and enforcing city regulations, be the same man who had terrorized Wichita as BTK? On February 25, 2005, law enforcement moved in. Rader was arrested near his home without incident. The calm demeanor he had displayed during his crimes was evident in his arrest. He didn't resist, nor did he deny who he was. In fact, he seemed almost relieved. Detectives brought him in for questioning, and over the course of hours, Rader confessed in chilling detail to the murders that had haunted Wichita for decades. He spoke about each victim with the same cold detachment he had shown in his letters, describing his methods, his motivations, and his belief that he could never be caught. Rader's trial was one of the most anticipated events in Wichita's history. The man who had terrorized the city for decades now faced his victims' families, the community, and the world. In court, Rader openly admitted to the murders, providing horrifying details of how he stalked his victims, broke into their homes, and carried out his crimes. One of the most chilling moments came when Rader recounted the Otero murders. He described binding each family member and taking their lives in a sequence he had meticulously planned. His lack of emotion left the courtroom in stunned silence. For the families of the victims, the trial was both a relief and a source of pain. Hearing Rader's confessions was devastating, but knowing he would never walk free again brought some measure of closure. Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, one for each of his known victims. In Kansas, the death penalty had been reinstated after his crimes, meaning Rader would spend the rest of his life in prison. For Wichita, the capture of Dennis Rader marked the end of an era of fear, but the scars left by BTK's reign of terror remained. Families who had lost loved ones struggled to rebuild their lives, while the community grappled with the knowledge that one of their own had been responsible for such horror. Rader's family, his wife and children, were blindsided by the revelation. To them, he had been a loving husband and father. They had no idea of the double life he had been leading. His wife filed for divorce shortly after his arrest, and his children severed all ties. Rader himself showed little remorse. In prison, he continued to write, documenting his crimes in a way that suggested he still relished the attention. His actions raised questions about how someone could live such a double life for so long, hiding their darkness beneath a facade of normalcy. The capture and conviction of Dennis Rader brought a sense of closure to a decades-long nightmare, but the psychological and emotional wounds he left behind still linger. For the families of his victims, the fear, pain, and unanswered questions remain a part of their daily lives. And for the city of Wichita, the betrayal of trust by one of their own cuts deep. The Otero family, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox. These names and the lives they represented were forever changed by Rader's actions. For the families, the loss was incomprehensible, made even worse by the cruel taunts Rader sent to the police and media. His letters didn't just confess to the crimes, they relished in the fear and chaos they created. Julie Shannon, a niece of Nancy Fox, once shared her thoughts on Rader's capture. Knowing he is behind bars doesn't bring her back, but at least the world knows who did this. He can't hurt anyone else. That's the only solace we have. For Kevin Bright, the sole survivor of Rader's attacks, the scars run deep. Kevin has spoken of his ongoing struggles with survivor's guilt, haunted by the memory of that day and the loss of his sister Catherine. He took everything from us, Kevin said in a rare interview. I survived, but I'll never be the same. Wichita itself bore the weight of BTK's crimes for more than 30 years. The city went from a place of safety and trust to one of fear and suspicion. For decades, residents lived with the knowledge that a serial killer was among them, hidden in plain sight. The revelation that Rader, a neighbor, a church leader, a Boy Scout volunteer, was BTK shocked the community to its core. Detective Ken Landwehr, who led the task force that ultimately captured Rader, reflected on the emotional toll of the case. We weren't just solving murders. We were chasing a ghost. And when we finally found him, it wasn't a monster. It was someone you'd never expect. Landwehr, who dedicated years of his life to bringing Rader to justice, expressed a mix of relief and sadness upon Rader's capture. There was no joy in finding him, just the knowledge that it was finally over. Rader's actions raised profound questions, not just about the crimes themselves, but about human nature. How could someone live a double life so seamlessly? How could he attend church on Sunday, lead Boy Scout meetings, and enforce city codes by day, while committing unimaginable horrors by night? Experts have speculated about Rader's psyche for years. Was he born with an inherent capacity for evil, or did something in his life trigger these actions? The duality of his existence, family man and sadistic killer, continues to baffle psychologists and criminologists. What drives someone to commit such heinous acts, and then confess through letters, knowing they could eventually be caught? Was it arrogance? A need for recognition? Or was it something deeper, something we may never fully understand? The BTK case leaves behind a legacy of pain, but also one of resilience. The families of the victims, the law enforcement officers who refused to give up, and the community of Wichita all endured a decades-long battle against fear. Their strength in the face of unimaginable tragedy serves as a testament to the human spirit. The story of Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer, is one of the most chilling cases in the annals of true crime. It's not just the brutality of his actions that leave a lasting impression, but the calculated way he carried them out, blending seamlessly into his community while committing unspeakable acts. This case stands as a reminder of how the darkness within a person can sometimes be hidden behind the most ordinary facade. Rader's ability to evade capture for more than 3 decades, despite his blatant taunts and confessions, showcases both the limitations of early investigative tools and the evolution of forensic science. His eventual capture brought relief to a city long gripped by fear, but it also raised uncomfortable questions. How could someone so deeply integrated into the fabric of society commit such heinous acts? What drove him to kill? And why did he choose to taunt his pursuers so openly? This story reminds us of the resilience of those seeking justice, the detectives who refused to give up, the families who fought for answers, and the community that endured unimaginable fear. It also forces us to confront the reality that true evil can lurk in the most unexpected places, sometimes even next door. What are your thoughts on this chilling case? Do you think there are deeper motives behind Dennis Rader's actions? Or was he simply driven by his need for power and control? Share your theories in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. If you found the story as haunting and thought-provoking as I did, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to In the True Crime Vault, and click the notification bell so you never miss the next episode. Together, we'll continue to uncover the stories that shape the world of true crime.